Back in the 1970s, hitchhiking was a common way to get around. People would wave down strangers for a ride without thinking twice, and most of the time, they made it safely to their destination. But not always. Sometimes, behind the friendly smile and a casual offer of help, there was something far darker waiting. For 15-year-old Mary Vincent, all she wanted was a ride to her grandfather's house. What she got instead would change her life forever. Let's get into it. Welcome to Old Casebook, where we uncover some of the darkest and most unsettling true stories from history. Today we revisit a case almost too gruesome to mention: the horrifying story of Mary Vincent, a young woman whose life was shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. This is not just a story of unimaginable cruelty, but also of survival, courage, and the strength to face evil head-on. Mary Vincent grew up in Las Vegas. By the age of 15, she had already faced more struggles than most people her age. According to reports, she didn't get along with her parents, often skipped school, and eventually ran away to live with her boyfriend in Sausalito, California. But that didn't last. He was soon arrested on assault charges, leaving Mary with nowhere else to go. She returned briefly to Las Vegas, only to run away again in 1978. For a short time, she slept in unlocked cars until she decided on a plan. She would hitchhike her way to Corona, California, to live with her grandfather. She also dreamed of starting a career as a dancer, something she was deeply passionate about. On September 29, 1978, Mary stood on the side of a highway in Berkeley, California, holding a sign that read, "Heading South." Car after car passed her by. Then finally, a van pulled over. Behind the wheel was a middle-aged man who asked where she was headed. When Mary told him she needed a ride to Los Angeles, he said he could take her. Other women nearby, also waiting for rides, reportedly looked uneasy. Some even warned Mary not to go with him. But desperate to reach her destination and feeling that this man reminded her of her grandfather, Mary ignored the concerns. She stepped into the van. The man seemed kind, friendly, even trustworthy. But what Mary didn't know was that this decision would lead her straight into a nightmare. The two soon set off towards Los Angeles. The man was Lawrence Singleton, a 50-year-old former merchant seaman. At first, the ride was pleasant until something strange unsettled Mary. She sneezed, and Lawrence reached over to touch her neck before asking if she was ill. Unnerved by the sudden contact, she quickly pulled away. Though the situation was awkward and uncomfortable for the 15-year-old, nothing else followed to heighten her unease, so she began to relax. After a while, she started to drift off, believing it was safe and reasoning that the trip was long enough to allow for a nap. Hours later, however, Mary awoke to find that Lawrence had taken a different route, one that would not lead to Los Angeles. Frightened, she grabbed a sharp stick she found in the car and threatened him, demanding that he return to the right path. Some reports say Lawrence reassured her they were still headed the right way, while others suggest he acted as though it was an innocent mistake before turning back. Either way, Mary believed him, and soon they stopped at a rest area. By then, unease had begun creeping into her bones, and she no longer felt that Lawrence's intentions were simply to give her a ride south. When he stepped out for a bathroom break, Mary noticed her shoes were untied and decided to get out as well, thinking she might need to run if things went wrong. As she bent to tie her laces, a shadow loomed over her. In the next instant, a sledgehammer smashed against the side of her head, sending her to the ground unconscious. When she awoke, the scene was drastically different from her nap just hours earlier. Her attacker was none other than Lawrence Singleton, the man she had trusted. He had dragged her into the van, driven deep into a canyon, and tied her arms to the van's walls so she couldn't escape. That night was one of unrelenting cruelty, as Lawrence repeatedly assaulted her. By morning, desperate and terrified, Mary begged him to let her go. His chilling response was, "If you want to be set free, I'll set you free." He then dragged her to the roadside, laid her down, and pulled a hatchet from the van. To her horror, Lawrence lifted it high and began hacking away at her arms. Writhing in pain and agony, Mary could do nothing but sit helplessly as her arms were mutilated until both forearms were severed from her body. The suffering she endured while still conscious is something no one should ever have to experience. Yet, even after putting the young girl through such pure torture, Lawrence was not finished with his inhumane crime. He tossed Mary over a 30-foot cliff near Del Puerto Canyon and stuffed her into a concrete pipe. Once done, he sickeningly remarked, "Okay, now you're free," before leaving her to bleed out, convinced he had committed the perfect crime. But even as Mary bled and suffered excruciating pain, she refused to give up. The thought that haunted her most was how terrible it would be if this man was free to harm other teenage girls. Miraculously, she managed to cover the remains of her arms in mud to slow the bleeding, then mustered the strength to climb back up the cliff. She walked 3 agonizing miles to the nearest highway, holding her arms up to minimize blood loss and prevent her muscles from falling out. The first car she flagged down sped off in fear after seeing her condition, leaving Mary devastated. Soon after, however, 2 individuals found her and rushed her to the hospital, saving her life. Despite her harrowing ordeal, she survived, and she was determined not to let Lawrence escape justice. She gave police a detailed description of her attacker, which ultimately led to his arrest. By that time, Mary had been given prosthetic arms, while surgeons used parts of her leg to salvage what was left of her right arm. This operation, however, meant she could never fulfill her dream of becoming a dancer. 6 months later, when the trial began, Mary faced her attacker in court, ready to testify against him despite the terror it brought her. Lawrence received only 14 years in prison with the possibility of parole. In court, he leaned toward her and whispered chillingly, "I'll finish this job even if it takes the rest of my life." Horrified, Mary left the courtroom pale and shaken, later revealing his threat. After everything she had endured, she received little compensation, and her injuries made finding steady work extremely difficult. Although Mary was supposed to receive $2.56 million from Lawrence after winning a civil judgment, she ended up with nothing since he had no money to his name. Lawrence was whisked off to jail, while Mary was left permanently damaged by the horrific acts he had inflicted upon her. For a time she went into hiding, terrified that Lawrence could somehow reappear and continue the nightmare she had barely escaped. Various news sources alleged that she developed anorexia, at one point reportedly dropping below 100 pounds. Later in life, Mary found comfort in a man she fell in love with, and the two married, though their relationship eventually ended in divorce. Meanwhile, in jail, Lawrence told his own bizarre version of events, insisting that Mary had threatened him with a sharp stick from his vehicle and acted as though she would accuse him of assault. He even attempted to sue her, though the case was quickly dismissed. Shockingly, after only 8 years in prison, Lawrence was paroled for good behavior and for serving as a teaching assistant in the prison classroom. Yet finding a place for him proved nearly impossible, as residents in town after town strongly protested his presence. In one instance, he had to be removed from a hotel in Rodeo, California, under armed guard after 500 people gathered in protest. Eventually, after numerous failed attempts to place him, Lawrence was housed in a trailer at San Quentin State Prison during his parole. After about a year, he was released as a free man and chose to return to his home state of Florida, a decision that likely deepened Mary's fears as well as public outrage over his early release and the possibility that he might act on his disturbing threats. Once settled in Florida, some neighbors described him in surprisingly positive terms. One man, Tom Bennett, admitted they were afraid of Lawrence at first, but claimed he later seemed like an ideal neighbor, friendly, generous, and hardworking, so much so that Bennett began to wonder if Lawrence had been framed. Another neighbor, who reportedly knew nothing about his dark past, even let her 2-year-old daughter play in the yard with Lawrence's Rottweiler puppy while chatting with him and her husband. Despite these outward appearances, it soon became clear that Lawrence's mental state remained in a very dark place. Even after beginning a new life in Florida, neighbors started to feel something was wrong when they noticed Lawrence repeatedly getting in and out of his vehicle. Concerned, they went to check on him and found him unconscious. They quickly called 911, and it was revealed that he had been funneling carbon monoxide into his van in an attempt to end his life. A note was later discovered beginning with the words, "I hope that I find peace," and continuing with his final requests, "I would like to thank everyone who helped me. Please have me cremated and have my ashes thrown into Palm River on the outgoing tide." Surviving the attempt, Lawrence was taken to a psychiatric care center and eventually released. Despite his struggles, which included 2 petty theft charges, he seemed to live a mostly normal life. But this new life was short-lived, as another horrifying crime soon followed. In 1997, a 31-year-old woman named Roxanne Hayes, who worked as a prostitute to support her 3 young children, met Lawrence at his home. A house painter unexpectedly arrived at the residence and stumbled upon a disturbing scene through the window. Lawrence was violently beating and strangling a screaming young woman. Instead of intervening, the painter drove away and called 911. When police arrived, they found Lawrence covered in blood. He tried to explain that he had cut himself while chopping vegetables, but the excuse fell apart instantly when officers saw Roxanne's lifeless body inside. She had been brutally stabbed numerous times, and reports stated that her fingers were nearly severed in the struggle. Lawrence later offered a strange explanation, claiming Roxanne had been stabbed during a fight over a knife after she allegedly threatened to cut his head off. He admitted to being intoxicated and depressed at the time, insisting the killing was an accident. In a bizarre detail, he further claimed that as Roxanne was bleeding to death, she asked him to hold her, and the two embraced. After she died, he said, he wept and tried to speak to her, though she could no longer respond. Upon hearing the news of Roxanne's death, Mary Vincent did not hesitate to testify once more against her attacker. She was asked to identify him and later said, "I wanted to see his eyes. Eyes are important. When he was on top of me, I was looking at the axe trying to stay alive. I asked later if I could look him in the eye, but it didn't happen." With her help, Lawrence Singleton ended up on Florida's death row. Despite giving numerous strange explanations and excuses, Singleton himself admitted, "I was framed the first time, but this time I did it." Roxanne's children, who were all very young at the time, remembered their mother with deep affection. Her 4-year-old son recalled a game they loved to play together, while her other children shared equally emotional memories. In 2001, years after committing his first devastating crime, Singleton died of cancer at the age of 74, before he could be executed. For Mary Vincent, his death meant the end of a lingering fear that her former captor might one day return to fulfill his terrifying promise. Over the years, Mary not only learned to live with her traumatic past, but also adapted to life with prosthetic arms. She taught herself to cook, draw, and even became an artist. She raised 2 sons, teaching them to be cautious with strangers, and through her resilience and strength, Mary's story became a powerful example of survival and courage. And that brings us to the end of this chilling case of Mary Vincent, a story that still leaves us questioning how such cruelty can exist and how remarkable the will to survive can be.